The Old Man Who Never Reacted. A Stoic bedtime story with quiet strength, rain sound. Some people think silence is weakness, but sometimes it's simply peaceful wisdom. Because there are those who fight to be right, and there are those who don't need to be right at all. This is the story of an old man who chose not to answer back. In a small village where everybody knew everyone else, there was an old man. No one knew his real name. Some said it was John. Others thought it might be Anthony. But in truth, no one had ever asked him, and he never told. He was simply the old man. The old man who was always there, watering the plants in the morning, when the sun hadn't gotten too hot yet, gathering dry leaves in the late afternoon, when the shadows began to grow, caring for the things nobody saw, that nobody valued, that nobody thought were important. His hands were rough like the bark of an ancient tree, full of calluses and marks of time, but as gentle as the breeze that caresses flowers. His eyes were as still as a windless lake, yet as deep as wells that hold generations of secrets. His hair was white like cotton, always tousled by the wind, and he had a beard he trimmed occasionally with an old pair of scissors he kept in his shirt pocket. He always wore the same clothes: a faded plaid shirt, cotton pants that had seen better days, and shoes that knew every stone in that village. It wasn't because he lacked money. People knew he had enough. It was by choice, by simplicity, because he understood that clothes don't make the man, but the man gives meaning to the clothes. He hardly spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was just what was needed. A good morning when someone passed by, a thank you when someone was kind, a single word that was enough, nothing more, nothing less. Not because he was impolite, not because he disliked people, but because he had learned that words are like seeds. If you plant too many, some won't sprout. If you plant few but with care, each one becomes a tree. Children made fun of him when he passed along the main street. They would run after him, imitating his slow, steady way of walking, like someone who's in no hurry to get anywhere because he's already where he needs to be. They made funny voices, mimicking the little he said. They threw small pebbles in his direction, not to hurt him, but to see if they could get a reaction. Any reaction. Grown-ups gossiped on street corners, making up stories about his life. Some said he was a widower whose wife had died of disappointment. Others said he never got married because he was too weird. Some claimed he had once been rich and lost everything in a bet. Others thought he'd always been poor and just resigned himself to it. Each person created a different version because the truth was that no one knew anything about him, and that was bothersome. Some folks, just for the sake of provoking him, just to see if they could, just to break that irritating calm, tried to get some kind of reaction out of him. Anything. A shout, a cutting remark, an angry look, a gesture of impatience. Any sign that beneath all that serenity there was a normal human being who could get irritated, who could feel offended, who could react like everyone else. But he would just look, the way you look at rain falling, knowing it will pass, and then he'd go back to whatever he was doing, always back to whatever he was doing. If he was watering plants, he kept watering. If he was sweeping leaves, he kept sweeping. If he was sitting on the bench in the square, watching life go by, he kept on watching. You know those days where everything seems to conspire against you, when you wake up and can already feel something's off, when people talk too much, judge too much, provoke too much, when every word you hear seems loaded with venom, every glance you get seems full of judgment, every gesture seems to have a hidden motive. When you feel the whole world is on the other side of a battle you didn't even know you were fighting. Well, the old man knew those days. Every day was like that for him. Not because he was truly persecuted or hated, but because he was different. And in a small village where everyone knows everyone, where everyone knows everyone's life, and where everyone has an opinion about everyone, different is uncomfortable. He was different in how he walked, too slow for some, who ran without knowing where they were going. Different in how he spoke, too little for others, who flooded the air with empty words. Different in how he reacted, too calm for those who lived in constant agitation. Different in how he existed, too simple for those who complicated everything. One day, a woman completely lost her temper. She was one of those women who talk loudly, who gesture a lot, who believe that whoever yells the loudest is the most correct. She had spent the entire morning listening to her friends talk about the old man. How odd he was. How no one knew where he'd come from. How he didn't socialize with anyone. She, who always had an opinion about everything and everyone, who always knew exactly what each person should do with their life, decided it was time to put the old man in his place. It was time for someone to tell him a few truths. It was time for someone to shake that irritating calm and show him how the real world worked. She found him in the main square, in front of everyone, at the busiest time of day. He was watering some flowers he had planted around the fountain. Flowers no one had asked him to plant. Flowers he tended because he believed the world was more beautiful with them. She shouted at him, shouted loudly, so loudly that people stopped to see what was happening. She accused him of things that made no sense. She said he thought he was better than everyone else. She said he was a phony, that his calm was just for attention. She made up stories about things he supposedly had done. She pointed her finger at him as if accusing a criminal. She waited for him to defend himself, to shout back, to prove his innocence, to show indignation, to do something that would justify all the anger she was feeling. Because that's what we expect, right? When we attack someone, we expect a reaction. We expect a fight. We expect the other person to enter our game. He looked at her, the way you look at a storm passing, knowing that soon the sun will shine again. His eyes showed no anger, no fear, no surprise. They only showed understanding, as if he perfectly grasped why she was doing all that, as if he'd been through it so many times that he'd stopped being surprised. He fell completely silent, didn't say a word, didn't make a gesture, didn't change his facial expression. He merely lowered his eyes with the gentleness of someone who doesn't want to embarrass anyone, and continued watering a small flower wilting on the sidewalk, a tiny yellow flower that seemed to need more water and care than he needed to defend himself. The woman grew even more enraged, because there's nothing, absolutely nothing, that infuriates someone who's angry more than the calm of someone who doesn't react. It's like throwing a stone into water and not hearing a sound. It's like shouting on a mountain and not hearing an echo. It's like trying to break something that's too flexible to snap. She shouted more. She said worse things. She made graver accusations. But the more she shouted, the more he stayed silent. The more she attacked, the more he retreated into his peace. And that drove her to desperation because she wanted a reaction. She needed a reaction. She had invested all her energy into that provocation and wasn't getting anything in return. People around started feeling uncomfortable, not with the old man, who remained quiet and kind, but with the woman, who seemed to be fighting alone, who seemed to be shouting at a wall, who looked like she was losing control over nothing. And when she finally tired, when her voice was hoarse from all the yelling, When she realized she was making a fool of herself in front of everyone, she left, stormed off, muttering under her breath, promising herself that next time it would be different. The old man went on watering the flower, as if nothing had happened, as if those 10 minutes of shouting were just a pause in his life, a pause he had spent in silence, waiting for the moment to get back to what truly mattered. Another day, 3 young guys decided it was their turn. They were the type who believe that being young gives them the right to disrespect the elderly, who confuse energy with arrogance, who think provoking others is a sign of courage. They found him sweeping the sidewalk in front of the church. It was a Sunday morning, and he always took advantage of people being at Mass to tidy public spaces without bothering anyone. He swept up the leaves that fell from the epee trees. He picked up papers the wind blew in. He straightened the chairs that were left askew. The young men approached with that look of someone ready to put on a show. They hurled cruel comments about his appearance, laughed loudly at how he dressed, made jokes about his age, mocked his loneliness. They waited for him to break, to show weakness, to beg for respect, to play the victim they expected him to be. But he simply lowered his eyes, took the broom in both hands, and kept sweeping, slowly, methodically, like someone who has all the time in the world, like someone who isn't there to prove himself to anyone, like someone who knows exactly what he's doing and why. He swept around their feet, making them move out of the way, not aggressively, not provoking, simply naturally, as if he needed to do his job and was politely asking them to step aside. The boys didn't know how to react. It was strange to provoke someone who didn't even seem to notice the provocation. They tried harder, spoke louder, went further with their insults, but he kept sweeping, kept gathering leaves, kept straightening the area, as if they were just part of the scenery, like wind that blows and makes noise but doesn't change the course of the river. The young men were at a loss. It was like yelling at the ocean and not getting a bigger wave back, like pushing a rock and not moving it an inch, like trying to break something that was already too whole to crack. Frustrated, they left, because provoking someone who doesn't react is like telling a joke to someone who doesn't laugh. It's pointless. It's useless. It's like boxing alone. You can throw as many punches as you like, but if there's no opponent, there's no fight. People started getting uncomfortable with his silence. It was strange. It was unsettling. Somehow, in a mysterious, inexplicable way, the absence of reaction said more than 1,000 replies could. It was as if his silence itself was an answer, one they didn't know how to interpret, but which made them think. Because have you noticed how it usually goes? When someone yells at us, we yell back and it turns into an argument. When someone offends us, we offend them back and it becomes a fight. When someone provokes us, we react and it becomes a show. Everyone understands that game. The game of action and reaction. The game of attack and defense. But when someone doesn't react to our provocations, to our barbed words, to our judgments, we're left totally lost. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to interpret it. We don't know if the person didn't hear us, or if they heard and didn't care, or if they heard and are plotting revenge, or if they really are indifferent. And that's unsettling, deeply unsettling, because it messes with an expectation that's so ingrained in us we don't even realize it's there. The expectation that every action triggers a reaction, that every provocation gets a response, that every attack meets a defense. The old man had broken that rule, and it left people ungrounded, with no reference point, unsure how to deal with him. It was like trying to dance to a tune only he could hear. He went on with his routine like a well-worn clock. He woke up at the same time every day, when the sun was still shy at the horizon. He had a simple breakfast: bread, butter, black coffee. Not out of lack of options, but by choice, because he understood that happiness doesn't lie in the quantity of things we consume, but in the quality of the attention we give what we have. Then he went about his daily tasks. He swept the sidewalk in front of his house and 2 or 3 neighboring houses. Not because those neighbors asked, none ever did. In fact, some even felt awkward about it. But he did it because he believed taking care of shared spaces was everyone's responsibility, even if not everyone saw it that way. He watered the plants in the public garden, a small flower bed in the town square that the city council had abandoned years ago. The flowers he grew there were simple: daisies, carnations, a few succulents hardy enough for the strong sun. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, but all tended with the loving care of someone who understands that true beauty doesn't need to be complicated. Then he'd sit on a bench in the square and watch. He watched people rush to work. He watched children heading to school, some excited, others dragging their feet. He watched shopkeepers opening up, some full of energy, others already tired before the day had even started. He watched genuine smiles and forced ones, interesting conversations and empty chatter, pressing urgencies that were necessary and those that weren't. He saw life happening around him like a movie he'd watched many times, but each viewing revealed new details. And whenever someone tried to provoke him, when someone came with a barbed comment, a mean remark, a gratuitous insult, he simply continued to exist. He breathed. He went on, like a tree that doesn't uproot in a strong wind but bends its branches so it won't break. Like a stone that isn't disturbed by the rain, but allows the water to flow over it and carry on. Like someone who had already understood something others were still trying to learn, who had discovered a secret that most people spend their entire lives trying to find, if they ever find it at all. We all have days that are harder for us, right? Days we wake up on the wrong foot, so to speak. Days when other people's words hurt more than usual. Days when a provocation cuts deeper, hitting a nerve we thought we'd outgrown. Days when all you want to do is scream, defend yourself, prove they're wrong, show everyone you're not what they say you are, that you're worth more than they think, that you deserve more respect than you're getting. The old man had these days too. He wasn't made of stone. He wasn't insensitive. He wasn't born with some superpower that kept him from getting hurt. He felt it. He felt every cutting word. He felt every look of contempt. He felt every provocation like a stone striking his heart. The difference is that he had learned to feel without reacting. He had discovered that there's a space between what happens to us and how we respond to it. A tiny space, sometimes barely noticeable, but it exists. And in that space lies our freedom. The freedom to choose how we'll react. The freedom to decide whether we'll let someone else's words define who we are. The freedom to decide whether we'll waste our energy fighting or use it to build something better. He'd learned this not from books or theories, but from life itself, through years of trial and error, through moments when he did react and regretted it, through situations where he shouted back and then felt small inside, through fights he'd won, which still left a bitter taste in his mouth. He'd discovered that reacting changed nothing. It didn't change the people provoking him. They continued being who they were, regardless of his reaction. It didn't change the words that were already spoken. Those kept echoing in the air. hurting and leaving their mark whether he answered back or not. It didn't change the judgments that had been made. They still existed in the minds of those who judged him. The only thing reacting changed was himself, and always for the worse, always leaving him more irritated, more bitter, more exhausted, always taking a piece of his peace away, always making him feel smaller than he truly was. So he chose not to react, not because he was too weak to stand up for himself. On the contrary, because he had discovered that not reacting requires enormous strength, far greater strength than retaliating. Not because he didn't know how to defend himself. He did. He knew exactly what to say to silence any tormentor. He knew their sore spots. He knew how to use words as weapons. But he understood that knowing how to fight and choosing to fight are two completely different things. That being able to respond and needing to respond are not the same. That being right and needing to prove you're right don't necessarily go together. He understood that his peace was worth more than any argument, that his tranquility was worth more than being right, that his silence was more powerful than any shout, that his serenity bothered bullies more than any aggressive comeback could. Because when you do react, you enter the other person's game. You accept the rules they set. You fight on their chosen battlefield. And on that battlefield, they have the advantage. Because they created the provocation. They picked the timing. They chose the weapons. But when you don't react, you change the game entirely. You refuse the rules. You don't step onto their battlefield. You stay in your own space, in your own rhythm, in your own peace. And that completely throws off anyone trying to provoke you. As the months passed, his routine remained the same, but something subtle started happening in the village. Something people couldn't quite put their finger on, but could feel in the air. It was as if his silent presence was planting invisible seeds in people's souls. Seeds that sprouted slowly, without hurry, but steadily. Seeds of questioning, seeds of reflection, seeds of change. Some people began noticing things they'd never noticed before. How sometimes they talked too much, how quickly they judged, how they overreacted to small provocations, how they wasted energy arguing over things that weren't worth it. Others started to observe more and talk less, to listen more and judge less, to take a deep breath before answering a provocation, to ask themselves if a particular argument really needed to happen. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't as if suddenly the whole village turned into an oasis of peace and harmony. People remained people, with their flaws, their impatient moments, and their little daily acts of unkindness. But there was something different in the air, a different kind of silence, a slightly higher patience, a slightly slower pace, as though the old man's silent example acted like a tuning fork, subtly adjusting the tone of the entire community, until one rainy afternoon, an afternoon just like the one you're hearing now, with that cozy sound of water falling from the sky, an afternoon when the world feels calmer and more introspective, a little girl approached him. She was about 8 years old, with big, curious eyes, the kind of child who asks questions adults have forgotten to ask because they think they already know all the answers. A child who hasn't yet learned that some things shouldn't be asked, or that certain questions don't have answers. She had watched the old man many times. She'd seen other kids tease him, and he wouldn't react. She'd seen adults speak ill of him, and he'd go on watering his plants. She'd seen people try to provoke him, and he remained in his unshakable peace. And it intrigued her, because children see things differently. They're not fully conditioned by social norms about how we're supposed to react in certain situations. They still have fresh eyes. They can ask simple questions about complex matters. She walked up to him with a child's naturalness. No ceremony, no social protocol. He was sitting on the bench in the square, as usual, watching the rain fall. Watching people run for shelter, umbrellas in hand, coats pulled over their heads. She sat next to him on the bench, didn't ask permission, didn't introduce herself. She just sat down, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, like they were old friends who met there every afternoon. They remained there, both watching the rain in silence. She swung her little legs, which couldn't reach the ground. He kept his hands on his knees, breathing slowly, both listening to the raindrops falling on the leaves, smelling that wonderful scent of wet earth, a smell only the rain brings, that stirs memories we didn't know we had, breathing in that unique peace only rain can bring, that feeling that the world has stopped for a moment, that there's no rush, that everything can wait, that it's possible just to exist without doing anything, without needing anything, without wanting anything but that exact moment. And then, out of nowhere, with the spontaneous honesty of children who don't rehearse their questions, who don't calculate the impact of their words, who simply speak their minds, she asked, "Why don't you ever answer?" Her question hung in the air like raindrops on leaves before they fall. Simple, direct, without malice, without provocation. Just genuine curiosity from someone who observed a behavior she couldn't understand and wanted an explanation. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not that quick glance we give when someone talks to us and we're just acknowledging them. It was a complete gaze. A gaze that saw not just a child with a question, but a human being genuinely interested in understanding something. Then he looked at the grey sky, heavy with thick clouds promising more rain. Then at the wet ground where puddles reflected the cloudy sky like natural mirrors. Then at the plants he watered every day, plants that were now receiving rainwater with silent gratitude. Plants that never complained if someone ignored them. Plants that never fought back if someone judged them. Plants that never got offended if anyone called them ugly or useless. Plants that simply grew, blossomed, bore fruit, offered shade, produced oxygen, existed in their fullness regardless of others' opinions. And he spoke, his voice as gentle as the rain itself, paced like someone carefully choosing each word, profound like someone speaking from a truth discovered through a lifetime of experience. Because fire doesn't answer the wind, it just burns. Those words came out just like that. No extra explanation, no context, no interpretation. Like a seed he planted in the girl's mind, one that would sprout in due time, when she was ready to fully understand what they meant. She sat there thinking, with that concentrated look children get when they're processing new information, trying to fit a new piece into the puzzle of how they see the world. She knew what fire was. She knew what wind was. She knew that a strong wind can blow out a candle. But she also knew that when wind blows into a bonfire, the flames grow bigger, stronger, brighter. She was starting to grasp something, but still couldn't put it all together. She couldn't yet put that metaphor into words that made total sense to her. He went back to looking at the rain, returning to his natural silence, returning to his characteristic peace, not because he wanted to end the conversation, or because he refused to explain more, but because he knew some truths can't be explained away. Some understandings can't be passed on with words. They have to be discovered, felt, lived. The child stayed for a little while longer. 5 minutes, 10, 15, just the two of them, the rain, and that sentence echoing in the silence. Fire doesn't answer the wind, it just burns. Then, when the rain started letting up, when the clouds parted enough for a few rays of sun to shine through, she got up and left. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say thank you. She left as naturally as she arrived. But she carried those words with her, words that only time would fully explain, words that only life would teach the true meaning of, words she would hold in her heart like a seed, waiting for the right moment to sprout, because there are truths that no extra words can clarify. There are truths we feel before we understand them. There are truths that live in silence, in patience, in the conscious choice not to react to every provocation life throws at us. In that small village, where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, where every move was observed and commented on, the old man carried on quietly. He kept watering his plants with the dedication of someone caring for their children. He kept sweeping the sidewalk with the attentiveness of someone tidying up their own home. He kept tending to the things no one saw, valued, or thought important, but which made all the difference. But his peace spoke too loudly to be ignored. His tranquility shouted louder than any yell. His silence taught more than any sermon. As if he already understood that some things can be overcome simply by not reacting. Some people are convinced solely by our calm. Some arguments are resolved simply by our silence. There is a power in silence that we only discover when we stop talking. There is a strength in non-reaction that we only feel when we stop reacting. There is a wisdom in acceptance that we only reach when we stop resisting. Years passed slowly, as they did in that village. The seasons came and went, each bringing its own colors, smells, and temperatures. The old man remained there, faithful to his routine, consistent in his peace, steadfast in his silence, and the people carried on being people. They continued talking, judging, provoking now and then, but something had changed, almost imperceptibly, something so subtle that maybe they themselves didn't notice. It was as if the old man's silent presence was working like an emotional thermostat for the community, lowering the temperature of conflicts a few degrees, reducing the intensity of reactions by a few notches. The woman who once shouted at him in the square began to notice how sometimes she spoke too loudly, how her voice rose when she was upset, how people around her got uncomfortable when she lost her temper, and she began, little by little, to take a deep breath before speaking in anger. The 3 young men who tried to provoke him grew up and became adults, and when they saw other young guys doing what they used to do, they felt a twinge of embarrassment. They remembered how pointless it was to provoke someone who simply did not respond. Some of them started stepping in when they saw similar situations. Not because they'd become saints or had some dramatic revelation, but because there was something in the old man's silent example that made them question their own actions. That made them wonder if they really needed to react to every provocation, to reply to every remark, to get into every argument. The little girl grew up into a young woman, carrying with her those words like an invisible talisman. Fire doesn't answer the wind, it just burns. And whenever someone tried to provoke her, whenever someone tried to break her peace, whenever she found herself in a situation where her first impulse was to react with anger, she remembered the old man. She remembered that rainy afternoon. She remembered his serenity. Gradually, she began to understand what those words meant. She experienced firsthand that reacting to provocations is like feeding a fire with wind. Sometimes it gets extinguished, sometimes it flares up uncontrollably, but it rarely leads to anything good. She learned there is a difference between being passive and being peaceful, a difference between not reacting out of fear and not reacting out of wisdom, a difference between cowardly silence and powerful silence. She discovered that internal fire, that flame that keeps us alive, creative, passionate, doesn't have to show itself as anger or aggression. It can be revealed as silent determination, firm purpose, unshakable peace. And when she became a mother, she taught her children, not through lectures or scolding, but by her own example. She showed them that you can be strong without being aggressive, that you can have an opinion without forcing it down anyone's throat, that you can stand up for what you believe in without attacking those who believe differently. The old man kept growing older. His hair turned completely white. His hands trembled more. His steps grew slower. But he kept up his routine as long as his body would allow, rising early, a simple coffee, tending plants, sweeping sidewalks, sitting in the square, observing life, and observing how life in the village was subtly shifting, how arguments were a bit less frequent, how people were just a bit kinder to each other, how conflicts were now resolved with more conversation and less yelling. It wasn't perfect. It never would be, because humans are imperfect by nature. There were still misunderstandings, disagreements, impatient moments, but there was a slightly different tone to these conflicts. Less intensity, shorter duration, faster resolution. It was as if the community had subconsciously learned that not every provocation deserves an answer. Not every word needs a retort. Not every judgment requires a defense. Not every opinion needs to be confronted. They had learned that sometimes there's a time to speak and a time to be silent, a time to act and a time to wait, a time to fight and a time to accept. And that wisdom lies in knowing which is which. The old man rarely left his house now. His knees ached when it rained. His hands shook when he held the watering can. His eyesight grew dim. But from the window of his simple home, he still observed, still cared for whatever plants he could reach, still served as a silent, peaceful presence. And the people of the village, who for so many years saw him as odd, different, someone who didn't fit in, began to feel something they couldn't name, a kind of gratitude, a kind of respect, a kind of acknowledgement. They realized maybe he wasn't strange, maybe he was just different, and different isn't necessarily bad. Maybe different is necessary. Maybe different is exactly what a community needs in order to grow, to evolve, to become a better place. Because communities, like people, sometimes need someone who breaks the pattern, someone who shows a different way of living, someone who proves it's possible to live otherwise, someone who serves as a mirror, reflecting people's own behavior back to them and giving them a chance to choose if they want to keep acting the same way. The old man never preached, never gave advice, never told anyone how they should live, never judged others' behavior, never criticized the way people reacted to things. He simply existed, simply was. He simply chose, day after day, moment after moment, not to react to provocations, not to play the action-reaction game, not to let other people's behavior determine his own. And that choice, repeated consistently over the years, became a silent teaching. It became a lesson the entire community had learned without realizing. One spring morning, when the flowers he had planted were brighter than ever, when the air smelled of blooming orange trees, when the birds sang more loudly because it was nesting season. The old man didn't wake up. He died in his sleep, peacefully, the way he had lived, without drama, without suffering, without making noise. He simply closed his eyes one night and didn't open them the next morning. When word spread through the village that he was gone, something surprising happened. People gathered to talk about him, share memories, and pay tribute in some way. And they found something that made them thoughtful. No one had a bad story to tell about him. No one held a grudge against him. No one had lingering resentment. No one had a legitimate complaint. Some remembered how they'd tried to provoke him and he never reacted. Others recalled how they'd spoken badly about him and he never fought back. Some felt ashamed of how they'd treated him. Others wondered why they'd been so bothered by his differences. But no one could say he'd ever wronged them. No one could recall him causing pain or suffering intentionally. No one could point to a time when he'd been cruel, petty, or vengeful, because it's very hard, nearly impossible, to hold on to anger towards someone who never returns it. It's almost impossible to resent someone who never retaliated. It's hard to hate someone who always chose peace, especially when peace was the hardest path. So there, in that informal gathering of people who came together to remember the old man, they finally understood something they may never have grasped had he still been alive. They understood what he'd been teaching all those years through his silent example. They understood that sometimes silence is the most powerful response there is, that sometimes calm is the strongest defense we have, that sometimes peace is the most complete victory we can achieve. They realized he wasn't weak, he was strong, so strong that he refused to be shaken by petty provocations, so strong he wouldn't waste his energy on pointless fights, so strong he wouldn't let other people's behavior dictate his mood. They realized he wasn't a coward, he was brave enough to be different in a community that pressured everyone to be the same, brave enough to keep his peace in an environment that prized instant reactions, brave enough to show kindness in a world that mistakes kindness for weakness. They realized he wasn't indifferent, he was wise enough to choose his battles, wise enough to save his energy for what truly mattered, wise enough to understand that not every war deserves to be fought. They decided to honor his memory in the only way that made sense, by continuing to care for the plants he had planted, by keeping the spaces he kept tidy clean, by preserving the simple beauty he had created with his own hands and quiet work. But more than that, they decided to honor his memory by trying to apply in their own lives what they had learned from his example, by trying to react less and reflect more, provoke less and accept more, judge less and understand more. Not everyone did so, not all the time, and not perfectly. Real change takes time. Old habits die hard, and it's easier to admire wisdom than to practice it. But some people, at certain moments, when they were about to explode in anger, remembered him, remembered how he met provocation with serenity. They took a deep breath and chose not to react, discovering that the world doesn't end if you don't respond to a taunt. Others, in the middle of a heated argument, remembered how futile it was to provoke someone who doesn't react. They lowered their voices, tried to see the other person's perspective, and discovered arguments can be solved without winners or losers. Some, when they found themselves judging someone for being different, remembered how they had judged the old man for years. They wondered if maybe that difference wasn't a problem, but a contribution. If maybe this strange person didn't need to conform, but instead be accepted as they were. The little girl, now a grown woman, told her own children about the old man who never answered back. She told them about that rainy afternoon when she asked a simple question and received an answer that took years to fully understand. Fire doesn't answer the wind, it just burns. And her children made the same thoughtful faces she once made, trying to grasp the metaphor, to decode its meaning. She explained, as best she could, what she had learned, that each of us has an inner fire, a flame that keeps us alive, energized and passionate, and the world is full of winds trying to extinguish this flame or make it burn out of control. Winds of provocation, winds of judgment, winds of criticism, winds of envy, winds of anger, winds of fear. And we can choose how to respond to these winds. We can let them blow out our flame, leaving us cold and drained. We can let them fan our flame until it burns wildly, consuming us with anger and bitterness. Or we can choose to be like the fire that simply burns, maintaining its heat no matter the wind, shining with its own light, providing its own warmth, existing fully, without feeling the need to react to every gust that comes its way. Today, when you leave here, when you go back to your life, your relationships, your challenges, you will encounter winds, people who try to provoke you, situations that test your patience, moments that challenge your peace. And you'll have a choice, the same choice the old man made every day, to react or simply to be, to defend yourself or hold on to your peace, to join someone else's game or remain in your own center. Remember the story of the old man who never answered back. Remember there's immense power in conscious silence, extraordinary strength in a chosen non-reaction, and a deep wisdom in serene acceptance. Remember, you don't have to respond to every provocation. You don't have to defend yourself against every judgment. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You don't have to enter every argument. You don't have to win every battle. Remember, your peace is more valuable than being right. Your tranquility is more important than any victory. Your balance is more precious than any recognition. And always remember, fire doesn't answer the wind. It just burns. Keep burning. Keep shining. Keep being who you are. In peace. In silence. In completeness. Like the old man who never answered, yet taught more than words ever could, who touched more lives through his silence than many do through their words, who left a more lasting legacy through his example than many leave with their actions. Be the fire that just burns. Be the peace that simply exists. Be the wisdom that simply is. And let the world learn from you, just as that village learned from the old man, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in gentleness, the greatest courage lies in calm, and the greatest wisdom lies in silence, and that sometimes not answering back is the most powerful answer of all.